Hello, today we're going to look at how to knit. In today's high-speed world, knitting is surprisingly enjoyable in a revival, sort of as a calming yet productive hobby. Whether it is a middle-aged man knitting in his cubicle to help keep his blood pressure in check, or a child being taught to knit in school because it teaches hand and eye coordination. The new generation of knitters do not fall neatly into any one category. If you want to jump on the knitting bandwagon, this step-by-step tutorial geared for beginners should start you on your way to a lifetime of knitting. Many stitches exist, but you are using knit stitch to begin. The entire purpose of this elementary knitting lesson is to teach the basics on casting on, knitting a row, and then casting off. Learn this and you can start knitting any basic article. Method number 1, making a yarn ball. Number 1, making a yarn ball. Most yarn comes in a skein that is not convenient to knit from, so your first step before starting to knit should be to make a yarn ball. Method number 2, making a slip knot. This will be your first stitch. Number 1, make a loop with the end of the yarn. The long end of the yarn, which is the one that is attached to the ball, should be on top of the short end. And number 2, place the loop on top of the yarn to the side of the loop, then pick up the yarn through the loop, pull it gently through the loop. Don't pull so much of it though, that will lose, the loose end shouldn't come through. So pull the knot right tight, then keep the loop at the open. So slip this new loop onto one knitting needle and then pull the end to tighten the knot around the needle. Let's look into the casting on. When you are casting on, you add more beginning stitches to your needle. There are many cast on methods, but the backward loop method shown with the backward loop is the perfect for beginners because it's easy and gets you started for knitting faster. So you have to hold the needle with the slip knot in the right hand, drape the working yarn, the yarn attached to your ball, behind your left hand and over your palm. Create your tail yarn and short end of the yarn attached to nothing, out of the way for now. Place the needle underneath the yarn across your palm. Pull out your palm from the yarn and there should be a loop formed around your needle. Pull that loop tight by pulling the working yarn, and so you have successfully cast on your first stitch. And repeat this process with your hand and the yarn until you have cast on as many stitches as you would like. Each time you do this, you create a stitch. The slip knot from previous step counts as your first stitch, and every loop you add in is another stitch. Keep your loops facing upward and uniform. Don't allow them to become twisted or it will be difficult to knit from. You also want to make loose loops with this method. Tight loops are very frustrating to knit from. Knitting stitches. Now, there are various kind of stitches you can make in knitting, but the actual knit stitch is only one of them. You can also do the purl stitch ribbing, for example. Since you have to start from somewhere, let's begin the knitting stitch. So you have to hold the needle with the stitches in your left hand and hold the needle without the stitch in your right hand. Consider wrapping some of the working yarn around your right middle finger. And this will make the yarn in the back of your work. Insert the needle without stitches under the front of the first loop, the one closest to the needle point, and push it through so the right needle sits behind the left needle. Make sure the working yarn, the yarn attached to your ball, lies in the back of your needle. Grab the working yarn attached to the ball, not your tail yarn, and wrap around the right needle counterclockwise so that it sits in between the two needles. Wrap the yarn from back to forth. Look in between the two needles. You should see two holes created by the middle yarn. Maneuver to the right needle up and down the position to over to the left hole. Poke the right needle through the left hole to the front of the needle. Do this slowly, making sure your loop does not slip off the needle. If you're not looking down at the needles but straight at them, the process will look a little bit different. Start pulling the inserted needle out of the loop slowly, making sure that the yarn you just wrapped around it doesn't fall off. It may help to hold that yarn tight so the loop remains snug around the needle. As the point of the needle is about to pull completely out of the loop, turn the point so that it faces you and make the yarn that was wrapped around it along. What you're doing here is pulling a loop through a stitch. The loop you just pulled onto a second needle is a new stitch that will replace the old stitch. Now that you've got a new stitch, pull off the old stitch. Hold on to the unknit stitches on the left needle with your left hand and bring the right needle and your knit stitch up and off the tip of the left needle. If you've created a knot on your right needle, you've knit correctly. If not, pull off whatever you've done, cast on another stitch and try again. Repeat the knit stitch until you've knitted every stitch that was on the first needle, and they'll all been transferred to the second needle. Stitch the needles. So move the needle in your right hand with all the finished stitches to the left hand, and move the needle in your left hand that is now empty to your right hand. Make sure your loops are all facing the same way and your knitted work is the right of your left needle. Knit every row and keep switching needles. Keep doing this and you'll start creating a garter stitch pattern. Then casting off. So cast off the end of your piece of knitting. This is also known as binding off and will transform your live loops into flat-lined edges of the knitted piece. Knit 2 stitches first. Insert your left needle into the first on the right needle or rightmost stitch. Lift the first stitch over the second stitch. Pull out the left needle, leaving the combined stitch on the right needle. Knit another stitch, then repeat the process until only one stitch remains on the right needle. Slip the needle out of the last loop. Keep the loop intact. Cut the yarn, leaving 6 inches, 15 centimeters end. Pull the cut end through the loop and pull it tight. You can cut off the end so it's very short, or for a more professional look, weave in your ends with a yarn needle. Congratulations! This is how you knit for the first time. And now there are some community questions and answers. People have asked, why do my stitches get so tight after about 5 stitches? So the answer is, maybe you pull too much on the thread when you're about to knit a stitch. The thread needs to slip a little through your fingers every time you knit a stitch so that it doesn't tighten too much. So be careful not to lose your grip on it though. This lets you choose how tight you want the stitches by pulling the thread more or less. There are questions such as, do I need a different type of needle depending on my yarn thickness? So the answer is, in general, yes, you will need a thicker yarn for a thicker needles for a thicker yarn, and a thinner needle for thinner yarns. It also depends on what type of looks you're looking for. If you want a looser weave, you'd want thinner yarn and thicker needles. If you want something very dense, you'd want the thicker yarn and the thinner needles. And there's another question, can I knit clothes using these techniques? Well, the answer is yes. You might need to learn new stitches and techniques for more advanced patterns, but these techniques can definitely be used to make scarves or other simple article of clothing. What does it mean to drape the yarn, and how do I do it? Draping the yarn is just putting it over your hand in order to keep it away from the project and to keep the tension so that your stitches end up being the same size. There are many different ways to drape your yarn. Someone put it only over their index fingers, so put it several index fingers, etc. So for simple projects like scarf made with knit stitch, draping isn't that important. You'll just want to make sure that the yarn is out of the way of what you're knitting. So why is there such a big gap of the yarn in between the needles? So answer is, you may be knitting too loosely or dropping stitches. You might also be pulling the completed stitch too hard. So how do I join another ball of wool to my knitting after I have been instructed to leave some stitches on the stitch holder but not to cut the yarn? Just start using another ball. Try your best to keep them from getting tangled, though it may be quite difficult. How do I join a second ball? Tie the beginning of the thread to the second ball at the end of the first ball. How many stitches do I have to cast on to make an adult-sized beanie? There are several ways to answer this question, because even adult heads comes in different sizes and yarn comes in different thickness. So on an average, I use 8 needles, size 8 needles and size 4 medium yarns, and when I cast on 80 stitches, it tends to go well. Where do I place the needle in my right hand when I knit a stitch? The answer is, if you knit English, this means throw the yarn around the right hand needle with your finger when knitting a stitch. This way you don't have to worry about where you put the needle, because it stays in your hand the whole time while your forefinger does all the work. Continental knitting does this even better. So there are quick summary. To knit, start by making a slip knot on one of your knitting needles, which will be your first stitch. Then cast on several times to create multiple stitches on your knitting needles. When you're finished casting on, insert your second knitting needle into one of the stitches you made and move the stitch onto the second needle. Repeat with all the stitches you cast on the first needle until they're all on the second needle, and then switch the needle and do the same thing again. Let's look at the tips. Knitting isn't just for women, it's for men too. There are as many knitting groups for men as there are for women. History tells us that knitting guilds in the 1400s were for men only. No matter what gender you are, knitting is one of the most relaxing and enjoyable and creative activity that can be enjoyed by all. So you purchase or make a knitting bag to keep everything handy and safe, including the pattern page. Knitting is a relaxation to help calm down your nerves. To knit, you need to be focused in order to have a steady hand, and avoid purchasing expensive wool if you're a beginner. These steps show you how to knit flatly. You need 2 simple pointed needles, but you can also use a circular needle, and tie the bottom of your loops when you take them out of your needle. If it's your first time knitting, it's better to use a thick yarn and a bigger needle, as it takes less time to knit a project. The next step is to not rush. A project runs a long time, especially if it's a very worthwhile project. Take your time, make it worth it, do a quality job. Practice makes perfect. After practicing, you will really start to enjoy the process, not just struggle in making a very tight, unusable dishwasher type of wool material. That was my first type of yarn that I have knitted. It was very tight, and once you start practicing, it's very easy to get used to the tension, get used to the movements. Your hands become more skilled and easy to coordinate. And smaller project can be very portable. Carry it with you when you know you'll be sitting down, whether on a park bench or in a library, while waiting for a dental appointment. Stay relaxed while you knit. This will help you with your tension. If your shoulders are tense, you might have trouble with the knitting too tightly. And avoid making your stitches too tight so that you can fit the needle through easily. This tip is hard to avoid when you're a first-time knitter, as when I was a first-time knitter, like I told you, it was very, very tight. Knitting, it was the movements were really foreign to my hands, so it was hard to create and make it loose. It just means that practice makes perfect. More and more practice. Just keep on knitting. That's all I can say. So don't be afraid to ask for help also. When you are finishing up a project, especially a long project, a big project, and then you suddenly realize you have made a mistake along the way and your yarn is unlooping, maybe you have missed a row in the middle. If it becomes unwinding all the way, even if one loop is not done, it's going to destroy the whole knitting project. But if you have been I think when there's such a problem, you will definitely need to read up on how to fix that. So for example, if you have missed a loop in the middle of your project and you have been keeping on knitting for like few centimeters away from it, you can fix that by taking crochet needles, taking hooking it up to the last sort of knitting active area. That's how you can bring it up. So that's why you also need to do a looser knit, easier to pull kind of knit. So yes, that's when you have a problem like that, you can research and check, what if I missed a loop in the middle of my project, how do I fix that? Then you can also bring your knitting project with you when you're traveling, because they're portable and they don't take up much space. Practice knitting daily to ensure that you don't forget how. Knitting takes a lot of focus and memory, and not knitting for quite a while can make it hard for people to learn again. Choose something simple for your first project, such as a pot holder or a scarf, and then progress to something a bit hard, like mittens. Beginning with the hard project can be very tiresome and can lower your self-esteem in how to knit when you first start. And now, for example, I remember my first knitting project. It was a mitten. It was a bad mistake. My grandmother was teaching me how to knit with a circular needle, and it turned out to be so hard material. It was a bad and hard material which can stand on its own. So that was very unusable product. So if I had chosen to do a scarf, a straight knit all the way up with a garter stitch, it would have been so much easier project, and it would have been successful. Now let's look at warnings. Manta needles are tiny needles that are hard to knit with. If you're a beginner, try using a larger plastic ones to start out with. It's easier to hold on to. Keep track of how many stitches you have on your needle. If the number goes down or up between the rows, well, Houston, we have a problem. So that means you have accidentally added a stitch along the way, or accidentally dropped a stitch. That's a horrible thing. Exactly, but you can fix that. It's easy to fix, only need to know how. Some needles can be very sharp or pointy. Find needles that you're comfortable with working with while you're knitting. For example, if I'm knitting it depends. If I have a yarn that is a good solid yarn, which means it will not unfurl when I'm putting the needle in, I like to use a pointier sharper needle, not too pointy though. I like the bamboo needles that I have a collection of it, and if I'm using a frilly that you can poke through the yarns type of yarn, I like to use a plastic and rounded edge yarns, but it depends, not too rounded though. So so knitting can be habit forming. Make sure you have the time to finish when you start a large knitting project. I cannot tell you how many projects I abandoned along the way and just let it sit there until now. I think probably years. So these are the beginners knitting techniques, how to knit. Hope that you have enjoyed this session. If you have, let me know on the comment section. And yeah, thanks. Have a good day, guys. Have a good night rest. Bye.